that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. And all allies agree that it is for the NATO allies and Ukraine to decide when Ukraine becomes a member. It's not for Moscow to have a veto against NATO enlargement.
That is why every European country that borders Russia and that does not want Russia to tear it apart should be a full member of the EU and NATO. And there are only two alternatives to this, either an open war or creeping Russian occupation.
Hallo und grüezi. Warnung, nichts für schwache Nerven. Beim informellen Treffen der NATO-Außenminister in Oslo wurden unter anderem die Situation in der Ukraine und die Mitgliedschaft des Landes in der Allianz erörtert. Laut Stoltenberg ist es nur noch eine Frage der Zeit, bis die Ukraine NATO Mitglied werde. Da spricht also die Stimme des NATO-Generalsekretärs Stoltenberg, ferngesteuert von den Kriegsfalken in Washington, und provoziert die russische Föderation bis zum Äußersten. Der Hauptgrund, weshalb der Ukraine-Konflikt überhaupt entstand, ist das Bedrohungsszenario gegenüber der russischen Föderation durch eine von Zelensky angestrebte NATO-Mitgliedschaft. Der Westen hat dies immer wieder abgestritten. Die Katze ist aus dem Sack. Dieser eine Satz macht jede Hoffnung auf eine Verhandlungslösung zunichte, wird weiteren 10.000 von jungen Männern ihr Leben kosten und hat katastrophale Konsequenzen für den westlichen Wirtschaftsraum. Der kollektive Wahnsinn des Westens wird Russland dazu zwingen, die gesamte Ukraine zu demontieren, mit fürchterlichen Konsequenzen für das Brudervolk der Ukrainer.
All allies agree that the NATO's door is open for new members. All allies also agree that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. And all allies agree that it is for the NATO allies and Ukraine to decide when Ukraine becomes a member. It's not for Moscow to have a veto against NATO enlargement.
Mir läuft es zum ersten Mal kalt den Rücken hinunter, weil die Russen von nun an gezwungen sein werden, immer weiter zu eskalieren. Bereits einen Tag nach Stoltenbergs Wahnsinnsäußerung hat Russland seine Angriffstaktik geändert und die Verluste auf der ukrainischen Seite waren enorm. Erster Clip. Daniel L. Davis, ehemaliger Oberstleutnant der US-Armee, hat sich im Gespräch mit Andrew Napolitane von Judging Freedom über den jüngsten Drohnenangriff auf Wohngebäude in Moskau in der Nähe des Kremls unterhalten. Der Militärexperte glaubt, dass es sich um ein Testmanöver Kiews handelt und rechnet mit weiteren Angriffen auf die russische Hauptstadt. Denn Vizeaußenministerin Viktoria Nuland hatte erst am Wochenende offen verkündet, dass man seit Monaten zusammen mit der Ukraine an Offensivplänen gegen Russland arbeite. Die gesamte Situation drohe außer Kontrolle zu geraten, so Davis.
Several drones, Ukrainian drones, were exploded in a high-end residential neighborhood not far from the official residence of President Vladimir Putin. There's one of them going off now. Now that one landed in an empty field. But can you tell from looking at the residue of that if it was a significant event?
They definitely did. Those, at least some of the drones, it doesn't appear that they were all of the same type, but especially that one, and apparently some of the others packed quite a punch and a very heavy payload. So you could see if that had actually hit a building, it would have caused substantial damage. But then some of the others that actually did strike the high-rise apartment buildings in the high-end neighborhoods you're talking about, Some of them caused only minor damage, so I guess they had different kinds there. But probably this was just a test of the Kiev regime to see what they could get through and how effective it would be. And I'm sure that this won't be the last time we see Moscow attacked. Kiev has to be careful because this could have an opposite effect in that it could harden Moscow's reserve and harden the resolve of the people, not make them panic or want to quit the war. So they have to be careful when they take these actions.
Would American intelligence have known of this in advance? And if the answer to that is yes, would American either State Department or DOD have consented to this, or is Zelensky a loose cannon, just sending drones to residential neighborhoods not far from where the president of Russia lives?
I think that this part of this is a test also of the Zelensky regime to see, is the West ever going to push back? They say we shouldn't do this, but if we do, what are they going to do? And I think that that's kind of what's going on here. I don't see any, at least public pushback on any of this. So I expect it'll continue.
It's almost as if we are sleepwalking into World War III.
Well, my concern is that there may be many that have this belief that, yeah, sure, we can just keep going, supporting this at this certain level. And even the Biden administration has limited what they've given in terms of amounts of equipment, et cetera. So they haven't given them enough to really, have a great rolling thunder, so to speak, of large scale tanks and aircraft and other kinds of things. But I think that the danger is that you think, well, we can manage this and just keep it contained there. We succeed because Russia gets hurt, and then eventually it'll come to some kind of negotiated settlement and we'll move on. But that assumes that you can control it, that the Russians act like they're supposed to, and that they don't escalate things because they get hit in their capital, or if something else happens later on, or they just get tired of all the help that the West is given and they expand the target list. I mean, so many things could happen. And it could escalate beyond our ability. And that is the biggest danger for America, and why I'm so an advocate that we need to get this thing wrapped up so that we don't have that risk.
Here's one of their cheerleaders with one of her latest outbursts, Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland. This is from May 27th. So this is this past weekend. On Saturday of Memorial Day weekend, she says this.
And even as you plan for the counteroffensive, which we have been working on with you for some 4 or 5 months, we are already beginning our discussions with the Ukrainian government and with friends in Kyiv, both in the civilian side and on the military side, about Ukraine's long-term future.
So is this kind of a public comment from a civilian leader in the State Department normal? We've been working with you on this offensive for 4 to 5 months.
Imagine if, while we were still fighting the Afghanistan war before that ended, you had the one of the senior Russian diplomats saying, hey, we've been working with the Taliban to kill Americans, and we've been doing this for months. I mean, we would be going crazy. And that's right. Exactly what this is going to do in Russia. This completely validates the Russian claims that this is the West against them. In fact, Lavrov, again this morning at a speech, said, look, this is just a full-scale war of the West against us, and they're just using Ukraine as the tool, but it's against us. And this validates that, because she expressly says the United States is working with Ukraine to attack Moscow in Russia. So, I mean, it couldn't be any more clear than that. And it's not in America's interest to do that. And I think that sometimes silence is the much better course of action. There is no chance that Russia would ever be driven from the field, especially when you start getting into Crimea, and then not use tactical nuclear weapons. So if we succeeded, like Victoria Nuland's talking about, then the chance of nuclear escalation goes through the roof. And that is not in American interest. And we need to really recalibrate just what our goals and objectives in this war really are.
Zweiter Clip. Im Gespräch mit Andrew Napolitano von Judging Freedom zu den jüngsten russischen Raketenangriffen auf wichtige Entscheidungszentren in der Ukraine sagte der ehemalige Oberst der US-Armee und Politikwissenschaftler Douglas Macgregor, dies sei erst der Anfang. Die Mehrheit der Menschen, mit denen man heute in Washington zu tun hat, sehen Russland immer noch durch die Brille von 1994-95. Sie glauben, dass sie es mit einem gescheiterten Staat zu tun haben, betonte er. Und weiter, nichts davon ist wahr. Russland hat die Ressourcen und die Fähigkeit, auf unbestimmte Zeit zu bestehen.
Are the Russian air defenses weak?
No, absolutely not.
Well, how did
Yeah,
this
if you
get,
look at
how
this-
would something like this get through? If this had hit the president's house, it would have destroyed it, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, it didn't come anywhere near the house. It's a residential area, but they seem to have petered out on their own. It may be they ran out of fuel or they had some kind of problem with the motors. Or that it could also be they were jammed because the Russians have done a brilliant job. They probably knock 300 or 400 Ukrainian drones out of the air every day, thanks to their jamming systems, which are the best in the world. So I don't know, except that I'm not even sure this was Ukrainian. There's some evidence that the SAS is involved, penetrating into Russia and launching.
What's SAS, Colonel?
Special Air Service. That's the British equivalent of special operations.
If they were Ukrainian, is it likely that American intelligence knew about it? And if the answer to that is yes, is it likely that the DOD or the Department of State or the National Security Council or whoever's giving Ukraine marching orders knew about it? I'm trying to figure out if President Putin would have an argument that Joe Biden or somebody who works for him ordered an attack on his house.
Well, I'm sure President Biden would insist on plausible deniability. Well, I wasn't informed, or we did not urge them to do that, something like that. You have to be realistic. Everything they do is based on data that we provide to them. In other words, overhead surveillance, overhead photography, down to the smallest detail. These things are not accidental. So the intelligence support is absolutely, definitely there. But again, plausible deniability. They didn't tell us they were going to do it today, but we knew they were going to do it for weeks. Well, the combination of arrogance and self-delusion is very powerful. Remember, the majority of people that you're dealing with in Washington today still view Russia through the lens of 1994-95. They think they're dealing with a failed state that has a weak economy, a society that is on the verge of revolt. I mean, these kinds of things are widely believed. None of it's true. Anyone else with half a brain understands the economy in Russia is very strong. Russia has the resources and the capability to last indefinitely. Every time the Russians have evinced any interest in a negotiation of any kind, we've refused it categorically. We've presented ultimatum after ultimatum and insisted that unless the Russians pull out of Ukraine completely, not just Ukraine, but the new borders from 1957, which were never Ukrainian, and then ultimately humiliate themselves and bow down and beg for forgiveness, there can be no peace. I think Putin and his colleagues have finally come around to understanding this reality. I don't think they wanted to believe it. It's true. So if it is true, and you take, for instance, the recent announcement where President Biden said, well, we should send the Ukrainians ATACMS. These are the Army Tactical Missile System that reaches out 200 miles. Still delivers a relatively small warhead, but it's nonetheless a good-sized warhead that can do a lot of damage. We said from the beginning that we were not going to provide these kinds of long-range strike weapons to the Ukrainians. Now, all of a sudden, we're going to do it. If you are a Russian and you're listening to this and watching this, you reach the inevitable conclusion that we are escalating. Every time we make an announcement, every time Biden speaks, the war escalates. And Putin has said, well, if you listen to his comments just within the last 24 hours, where he talked about the recent strike on the military intelligence headquarters in Kiev, that was struck, I think, either by an Iskander missile, tactical ballistic missile, or Kinshal missile, killed large numbers of people, destroyed the entire headquarters. And I think it killed probably several NATO officers, about which we're hearing nothing. And that's something we should hear about. We should know the truth. If Americans are dying over there, along with Frenchmen and British and other officers, then for God's sakes, tell us. But they're not going to, obviously. But Putin has said, well, we've often talked in the past about hitting the quote unquote decision centers. Well, now they will. And Russian intelligence has always known where everything is. You cannot hide from this overhead surveillance. They've got the equivalent to the National Security Agency and the equivalent of the CIA. They can see everything and hear everything. So now they can systematically go after all of these headquarters filled with the so-called decision makers. I think that's just the beginning.